So, welcome to week 3. And by now, you should be comfortably set up in the class, know where everything is, know where all the bells and whistles are, know how to communicate with me, know how to communicate with each other. As I told you before, it goes really fast. So, I've been looking to see, and I know some of you haven't quite got into all the discussions yet, but I want to remind you it really is important that you stay up because the discussions don't work unless you're actively engaged in the process during the time. So I really need for you to try to get up on those because it's like if I respond to a comment in the discussion and the next person doesn't respond for a week, it doesn't do anyone any good. I want you to think of it more like we're in a classroom, and in the classroom, we are in the process of having a discussion. And with that, we are going to be able to sort of articulate and share our ideas and opinions. Because really, what I'm asking you is, what do you think? How do you feel about the things you're learning about the question that I've asked you? And I'm looking for you to give me a really sort of a sharp answer about the question that I've asked. And that's really the heart of what I'm looking for. So please stay on top of that. Don't get too far behind because it will blow up in your face. I've seen it too many times. So trust me on this. Try to get caught up, okay? And the discussions are primarily the most important. However, don't forget on those, don't lag on those chapter overviews either, okay? And again, I just want to know what in the chapter overviews, what it is you think about what you learned in the chapter. Give me a couple of examples of why, what you thought were particularly important and interesting and why, okay? And that's really it. So without further ado, this chapter we're going to be covering the isms. We're going to look at political ideologies, and then by now you're starting to build like a little bit of a base. And this base is fundamental to your view of the world because a lot of what you're learning now is basically the ideas of what it means to be a liberal or conservative, where those ideas come from, and so it has to ask the question: is it even valid? Does it really matter if you're liberal or conservative? Um, I would argue more and more today we see more people who are basically saying they don't want to identify with either side. They want to be free thinking, and most of us, to be honest with you, are somewhere in the middle. Most people don't reside on one side of the aisle or the other, or one view of the world. So, for example, you might be really big on the environment, but you might be really tough on the abortion issue. Well, what does that make you? Well, the environment is more the liberal side of things. The abortion issue is more the conservative side of things, generally speaking. So, what does that really make you? Well, it makes you a normal human being that you could care about one thing a certain way and something else in another way. So the fact that trying to sort of say that there's an absolute, I think, is where we kind of fail sometimes as a society and politically because they want you to push you to try to stand on one side of the aisle and their job is to demonize the other. And that's unfortunate because, like I said, the truth is most of us are somewhere in the middle. So let's jump into this a little bit and take a look at the idea of the isms and let's get a chance to learn a few things. So here we go. Welcome to the isms. And again, this is where we're going to get a chance to learn about different types of systems and how the government operates. And I think you're going to find it to be really interesting. So as you can understand, and as you see here, I'm going to move this out of the way. So I'll be hiding myself down here in the corner. So let me go out of the way here. um, so we concepts basically start around some very basic premise. And the first notion is the idea of political parties. Um, and most political parties, again, base their view of the world on certain ideological path or principles that define their political parties and who they are. And a lot of those are based on either ideas of how they view the world through, as you can see, they use the example of symbols. Uh, and what's symbolic of certain social groups within society and how should they work and operate and function within society. And so, on one hand, you could say, so political parties basically are like interest groups. And interest groups are organizations or entities that basically define or sort of set up the premise of how they see the social fabric of society and how it should operate. And then within that, the idea of political ideologies have basically two basic dimensions. And as you can see here, the first one is called goals. And basically goals are like, so what is the objective? What are we trying to get to? How should society work? But remember, in answering that question, it's all based on your view of the world or the person who's creating the ideology, their view of the world. It doesn't mean that it represents the entire view of how all 330 million Americans see the world. But it does dictate a basic principle about how they think the world should operate, or how it should be what they call arranged. And then the other process is the methods. And basically, it's the process of, so if you have a certain view of the world, how do you make it work? How do you achieve the ideal of what you, in your view of the world, and your ideology, how do you make it actually work? And I think that's a very interesting question to pose. Um, and so, consequently, it leads us into some other aspects dealing with things like, the issue of freedom. Can you have too much freedom? You know, um, what does it mean to have freedom? Even that's a really interesting question. People think of freedom as being, well, you should do what you want whenever you want. Well, that sounds wonderful, but the truth is, what that really leads to is anarchy. And the question: do you want to live in an anarchic state? Some people would say, sure, why not? Other people would go, I don't know about that. Uh, so this is kind of where we find ourselves at the beginning of this discussion, trying to figure out where we fit in this process. And then, the idea of, when we talk about ideology, what's the difference between ideology and philosophy? Well, the philosophy is basically how human nature. It has to do with how we decide we want to live our lives as human beings on planet Earth. Uh, and so it looks at like an idealized way of how we as human beings in our natural human nature, how we conduct ourselves within society. And when you talk about an ideology, it really is more about, again, the function, how we go about living our best life within the society we've created. So the broader concept is very philosophical, very sort of theoretical, which is where the idea of political theory stems from, as opposed to sort of methodical, which is, again, the idea of how we in society operate and conduct ourselves. Now, let me continue on here. This works properly. I'm going to jump a little ahead here. So when we look at the political spectrum, and this again is where you sort of build your base about how you view the world, we call the left side, or the left, the more liberal side, and we call the right the more conservative side. And so you can see here across the spectrum, from the far left, they start with communism, and then they get to what they call center left, and that's like socialism. And then they have the center, which is kind of basic liberalism. And then they get to the center right, which we call conservatism, and then the far right, which is fascism. And we'll talk about each one of these in the context of this discussion, or this lecture that I'm providing you today. And it's interesting because even within the definitions of each one, they are very subjective. So what socialism means to one person may mean something completely different to someone else. So sometimes it's in the eye of the beholder. And the example they're using here and illustrate this is Canada, but I'm going to use it in a more broad, esoteric terms. So let's continue here, if I may. So here's a great chart that shows you the breakdown. So if you look in the top left, where it talks about the left, and they call them socialists, right? And under the idea of socialism, which is ironically is based in the book of Deuteronomy from the Bible, and it was really about people helping one another, and the, that was the basic principles of socialism. Uh, Not sometimes what the more modern version that we look at, or how people try to perceive it, or how they have defined it. Uh, but it's rooted on the Bible, and that's what a lot of people don't realize. But you can see there in that first box, it talks about and sort of defines what socialism represents, and it says again the greater economic uniformity, greater social uniformity, and which relies on big government. Um, and then the extreme version of it is called communism. So that's the far left. But socialism basically is that. So what the premise is that you have better economic equality throughout the nation, or a country, or nation state, or society at large. And then you have more equality within not just economic freedom or economic equality, but also social equality. And then below there, you have the liberals. And under the idea of liberal, or liberalism, if you would, again, it calls for greater economic uniformity, uh, So it says there are less economic freedoms, and then it also calls for greater social freedom. So while on one hand in socialism you have uniformity where you're trying to find equity within to make sure that society operates within a certain parameter, so you have less social freedom under socialism because they set up a defined sense of norms that how society should operate. Under liberalism, you have more independent ability to sort of act as you want. So less uniformity, more ability to sort of actualize or live your own free way the way you want to live it. And the view of government is that it should be medium sized. And the idea that there is, that the uh, extreme version is say what they would call the hippie commune. So going back to a day where people were kind of like extreme versions of sort of dropping out of society and kind of just living their own way, their own writing their own story, right? Without any fear of government impingement. And then on the top right, you see the ideas of conservatives. And under conservative ideology, they have, again, greater economic freedom. So there's not the economic uniformity that exists within socialism uh, or even within liberalism. And then but there is a greater social uniformity. So therefore, there's less social freedoms. And again, this is also similar to, but not exactly like liberalism, because it's not that different. It's sort of a little nuance between what the liberals think, where it says there are less social uniformity, um, but it's more like the socialist ideology, ironically. So socialism and conservatism, or conservatives, have the same view of social uniformity, that there should be less social uniformity. The question is how they see that uniformity manifest itself. And so the conservatives have a certain view of the world about traditional values and where they should exist within society and how you should hold on to those traditions. That's not the same view as socialism, even though they both promote the idea of less social freedom. And again, the response to government is that government should be medium-sized or even small government. Sometimes people talk about there being smaller government. And it's a very controversial notion whether to have big government, what even a medium-sized government looks like. And the idea is that people say big governments control everything and they do whatever they want to do. And there is some basic truth to that. However, you've got to address the needs of 330 million people in America, for example. So you need a fairly big government or bureaucracy to be able to provide the goods and services that 330 million people need. And the conservatives would say, well, we want less government, so we want less interference in our lives. Well, that would be wonderful if if all those who control the economics and the rest of it all played fair and tried to distribute the wealth and economics fairly across society, and including social freedoms across society. But that doesn't happen a lot of times, and so that's where the question comes in: is how big government should really be. And then the extreme version of conservatism leads to what we call the religious right, where they basically throw God out in front of everything and basically say this is the way God wants it. But again, this is based on their vision of what they think God wants. And your vision or any other person's vision may be slightly different than that. Just like in any other thing, religion has its place, obviously, in our society, and it's an intrinsic part of our society. But there are more liberal aspects of people how they see religion, and some are very conservative and strict in their religious beliefs. So, uh, and that's where it gets complicated. That's where all these ideologies get complicated. And then the last one is libertarians, right? And you can see there in the libertarians that again they call for greater economic freedoms um, and greater social freedoms and little or no government. And again, in the extreme version, they really basically lands you in the place of anarchy. And anarchy basically means there is no government. Basically, everybody does what they want to do, like the Wild West. And the question is that reality of what people really want in society? I would argue it's a very aggressive and very altruistic state, but because of human beings and and our ability to be sort of us looking out for our own self-interest, uh, having complete freedom to do whatever you want is not really a realistic state to live in any society because there are always constraints and controls to protect the citizens and protect the infrastructure. So that basically is why it doesn't ever work in its purest form. In fact, I would argue that none of these actually work in their purest form. They all have certain positives about them, and they all have certain negatives about them. So defining and figuring out what those are is what we have to do, and sort of ask the question. And that's why it's kind of hard to just lump yourself and stick yourself in one box and say that one box fits all. You might say that this box is closer to representing me, and then what we see, and you won't see it in this particular chapter, but we have variations of this. So, for example, if you look at most of the European countries, there is what we call social democracies, and social democracies are democracies basically that have a semblance of socialism, and also a semblance of liberal ideology. So they can operate between the two. Um, and so within that, they try to find their example of what works best for them. But I would also tell you that it's not a one size fits all. So you could have a social democracy that works well in one nation state or one country that doesn't work well in another. And there are lots of different reasons for that. It might be because of the social integration, the historical context, economic context, resources. There's a lot of things that dictate why some things work better in other countries than other countries. And that's another thing to be explored that we like to look at as political scientists, particularly under political theory and looking at human nature. So communism. So communism derives from a very couple of guys that were fairly complicated, and certainly Karl Marx is the primary person who gets put out in front of it. But Friedrich Engels, who co-write the Communist Manifesto, are certainly front and center on this. Um, but Karl Marx was an economist basically who had a theory about what would happen when people who were being run over by the wealthy in society, which he called the bourgeoisie, how the proletariat, the working people would what their clashes would lead to. He said the clashes were inevitable, but he said that when people got tired of being run over, or they couldn't purchase the goods that they were building or making or producing, that they would overthrow, that overthrowing would be violent and brutal. Uh, so, the concept and the notion is that, that the community or society should own the means of production and should share in all that with each other. So it's like if your country's doing well, that they should share their wealth with all the members of society. And at the time that he writes this, private property is the primary driver of the wealth of society. So they believe that if you got rid of the private property, that then you wouldn't have all this competition, and crooked people wouldn't try to abuse the system, by trying to hoard all the property. Um, they also believe that there shouldn't be a class society. There shouldn't be just the rich and the poor. They didn't believe in that. They said it should be distributed equally across the board. Um, but then again, when you look at the idea of violent overthrow, or these what they would call communist revolutions, the examples they use are uh, the Soviet Union, Cuba, Vietnam, China. But you could even go back and look at the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, 1917. You could go back and look at the French Revolution. There are lots of examples of what happens when the rich and poor clash, and the reasons behind why they clash. And then we would draw and say, so what do we learn from this? What does communism teach us about the world? And are there variations of communism that could actually work? And that's an interesting question to also pose. And then under the example of socialism, so this basically has the idea of that, like basically a collective good that government should control and distribute the means of production, and they should be distribute the wealth across society, and that it shouldn't be just housed within one corporation or multinational corporation, for example, or just within the government. So if a government gains wealth, they should share that wealth. So they use examples like Norway and Sweden as being examples of what we would call social democracies. So they have they have democratic practices, but in that they also, they share the wealth with the country. Now, a lot of these countries have high taxation. So people look at Sweden and say, well, the tax rate is like 60%. And people balk at that and go, yeah, that's a lot. So why would I do that? Well, when you think about America, if you make, let's say, 100,000 or more a year, which sounds like a lot, but really isn't a lot. you're paying a 30+% tax bracket. Plus, remember, everything you buy in America, other than basic groceries, is taxed. So by the time you get through paying taxes on everything you pay tax on, gasoline, everything else that you have to use in society, guess what? And including your, by the way, including all your utilities, you are paying probably equally as much as they pay in Sweden, or near as much, and they get a heck of a lot more for theirs than we get for ours, including reasonable or low or no cost education. Um, and if something happens and you lose your job, you don't have to go live in squalor. They have a very good infrastructure to protect their citizens. So what you get for the return on your investment for having high taxation is to make sure that you are protected as a citizen and a worker within their societies. And that's a huge step.